Jeremiah Nortier is at it again. His entire thesis, the whole hour and 8 minutes, is trying to prove that works in Romans 4 doesn't just mean works of the law of Moses in context, that it has a broader principle of works and obedience and all these things. And he's got it backwards to the point that he's completely misrepresenting the letter to the Galatians. Because Romans talks about works other than the law of Moses, so does Galatians, and so does Paul elsewhere. But Galatians, every single reference to works is exclusively to works of the law of Moses for deeds of the law. The Galatian error was, you must be circumcised and keep the law of Moses, Acts 15, in order to become a Christian. They were binding that on the Gentiles, but that's a completely different faith system. That is not what was taught by Jesus or the apostles. So he wants you to think that works in Romans 4 means something different than it does in Galatians, something different than it does at the end of Romans chapter 3, something different than it does at the end of Romans 4 when it's talking about Abraham's circumcision. He wants you to think that the moral principle applies, like the moral law of God, even though circumcision is not part of that moral law. It is a specific thing tied to the promise of the covenant of Abraham, something that is tied closely with the old covenant. He's mistaken to say that the law of Moses contains the moral law. If anything, the moral law of God is broader than the law of Moses, broader than the law of the conscience on the heart of the Gentiles. The Gentiles had a limited amount of knowledge about God's moral law. The law of Moses gave them more principles that the Gentiles had, no understanding of. But the new covenant gives us even more insight into the broader moral law of God. The law says not to commit adultery. Well, if you look upon a woman with lust in your heart and you would act on it if you were given the opportunity, then you've broken the law. That's not what Moses taught. That's not what you get from the Old Testament, but that is the moral principle. Now, my third point, all of this is pointless and fruitless because you have to deal with the understanding that the obedience and commands that we're claiming you need to be saved are to the gospel, not to the old law, not to the new law of the new covenant. Believe, repent, confess Christ, be baptized. These are not a part of the old law. These are not a part of the new law. They are commands of the gospel. The word gospel is used to speak of Caesars who would give good news because they had done this or that. Christ is king and he gives you the gospel. How you come into his kingdom, how you place citizenship in his kingdom is not the same as the laws you live under once you're part of that kingdom. So even the accusation that we're conflating law and gospel is untenable. I think it's clear from the context that Paul is distancing the law of Moses from the gospel, from the new covenant. That's the only way he can deal with the Jew-Gentile problem. You don't enter the new covenant, you don't enter the kingdom by going through the old system first. You come into the kingdom by obeying the gospel commands. Believe, repent, confess Christ, and be baptized.